All right. I was watching that attendee count climb and it's taken a little bit of a pause, so we can go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. By joining us today, you acknowledge that this session will be recorded or is being recorded and will be shared with TLC related materials. Microphones will be muted for this presentation, but we encourage you to post questions and comments in the chat. And also, we have enabled live transcription. To use that feature, please click the Show Captions or the CC button located on the Zoom toolbar. And now I am pleased to introduce to you our esteemed academic leadership team who will be sharing their perspectives on Senge's discipline and how those disciplines manifest themselves in their work and in their leadership approach. I'll turn it over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haley. Well, we spent a lot of time figuring out who was going to go first, and I'm sure you won't be surprised to know that Blake drew that straw. So Blake is going to kick us off.
That was an easy wind up for the pitch. Thank you, Haley and Teresa. Happy to have everyone here today. And I hope after to wrap up 3 days of great learning that you're up for just another conversation and hopefully a pretty interactive and interesting one. So throw the stuff in the chat because this is an informal group. For those of you who aren't part of UAGC, this is a great collection of leaders in our academic affairs division, and we decided we'd sort of huddle together for this session and think about different perspectives on the same question using the five sort of frameworks from of how we build an appropriate learning organization. And what it's fun for me as the person who has the privilege of technically supervising, but I think they supervise me most days, these four folks, is the differences that we bring to how we approach learning an organization as leaders. And so I think you're going to hear a few different perspectives from us today. So I think that's kind of fun. So the one that I'm going to kick us off with, which I think is appropriate as far as the order of operations, although it could go in different orders, and has not to do with me, but it has to do with vision. It has to do with the way that we think about a shared vision and a learning organization. And so there's just a couple things I want to frame about that, and then I don't do it too often, but I'm going to tell some war stories. But the step back part of it is, as educators, I think we intuitively or very explicitly build into our practice the idea of what our students ought to learn. Right, that we know that we have whole great assessment teams at UAGC. We have a fantastic assessment team led by Tricia Lauer. We have the idea of we ought to have some learning. Our accreditors think about that learning, and then we're very intentional when we build programs. Our friends in student affairs and other offices that work directly with our students also have that sort of mindset. Like, what are we doing this for? What's the outcome related to that? And that's great, and that's intuitive. And then we stop. And I think we often aren't thinking about, well, what's the vision of learning? What's our learning outcomes that we're thinking that we're a part of? How do we wrap our heads around that in the way that we think about being a learning organization? And appropriately, Senge brings us to the idea of vision and doing that, because an outcome has an implicit understanding of, like, if you learn something, then you've kind of learned it. And an organization's vision is sort of that aspirational learning that continues over and over again, where we keep going. We talked in my session yesterday a bit about how is it just something you'll never quite reach in general in a learning organization, and that's a good thing to puzzle through in our teams. But more appropriately, thinking about vision, it's what wakes us up in that morning and gets us to work, and why we're all there and how we get there. And what's interesting as someone that has led strategic planning in a number of different contexts is that most people in most organizations think that vision, or the outcome that we're seeking, the learning that an organization might be going for about how to do something, is unstated or obvious, or because we're all at the same organization, it must be that, right? And that we come to the table thinking, well, yeah, we're a university and our vision is to, like, teach some students or something, and we do that sort of thing. And what's interesting, and especially if you're a student of this work and you kind of roll around and look at different learning organizations, even those that look like they should be the same, is that these visions vary wildly. Like, the way people think that their organization what they're going for and why they're there, the purpose around that actually diverges in quite interesting ways. And that no, we're part of a large here, UAGC, part of a large R1 land grant university. Those are not all built alike. And they actually have different visions for the ways that they work. Some of that relates to the local context of the states and students they serve. Some of that relates to the constellation of other higher education institutions that are in the system in their states. Some relate to history and happenstance. Like there's different sorts of things that inform that vision that are all authentic and appropriate and perhaps not something you would normally think about. So that's sort of the background of that there's different sorts of things. So it gets to then it raises the question of how do we come about that? How do we come about anchoring a learning organization and a shared vision? If it's not obvious just by the organizational type, what that is. The war stories I want to share is my experience with that. And it's particularly because the word in this Senge's work is shared vision, right? Like it's not just like my vision as the boss or some, leader or even a board's vision of an educational institution, but what is the shared vision and how do you go about that and how do you build that shared vision? So in two different organizational contexts, by weird happenstance of my odd career, I was charged with bringing different organizations together that had not administratively been housed together, and not just to like sort of supervise them together in what I would call, in one instance, a strip mall kind of way, where like you're all different stores and you share a parking lot maybe, but you're really kind of you do your own thing. If you're there for Subway, you're there for Subway. If you're there for Ulta, you're there for Ulta. You share a parking lot. But what's the shared purpose for that, and what is the shared vision for that? Which evolves the strip mall into something more along like an Amazon marketplace, like an integrated, broad way of selling goods and services in one context and one platform. How do we do that? So um, with that antecedent in mind, where you're thinking like, well, how do you put Ulta, Subway, and the tire shop together into one shared vision? I worked in a school improvement center that at the University of Missouri in the College of Education that brought together several different outward-facing entities, a regional professional development center that helps educators, a center for school um, uh, uh, assessment and leadership improvement, a service that helped transitioning kiddos that with disabilities moving from school to career, several other things coming together. And all these professionals did their thing, in large part based on funding and based what their charge was, right? In another context, at Colorado State University, I had to bring together um, CSU Online, outward facing for credit education, a continuing education arm with that, the extension education system, which is the place-based cradle to grave learning in counties around the state, campuses that were sometimes joint with community colleges around the state, and a Colorado Water Center, which is a statutory thing that cares about water, which is an important thing if you live in places like Colorado, and several other centers that all were under this headline of engagement. And the charge was put this all together, put all these buildings in the strip all together into one shared vision. And my takeaway from that, and what I'll end this with, is process. And thinking about the way that we did that, because it almost doesn't matter what we came up with. And we did come up with, where individuals and communities could thrive from lifelong learning. Like we came up with these vision statements that knitted those activities together. Um, and that process was highly participatory and it was iterative, meaning we didn't just carve it in stone and be done with it. The process took at times years. And to me, and my takeaway that I'm sharing with this is that that's sometimes counterintuitive. If you think about these five different things, the others seem like the stuff that you dig into for years at a time and work on, when actually there's some work to be done to really learn and sit with your vision for a while, to have different people contribute their parts and then come together and say, wait, did that work? And how do you go back around to your stakeholders, to all the tenants in the strip mall and come together like, did we get that right? Do we have that? Are we facing the way that we want to face? Are we building our teams in the way that we want to go? along the way, and then how do we get there? So that iterative process that was highly collaboratory and bringing people together mattered a whole lot. And the last thing I'll say to tee it off to the others is that then the test of whether that shared vision was right, was working, was the test of how it enacted and played itself out into what would probably be the other four areas here. How did it drive our system thing? How did it show up in our work in a variety of ways? And so, as we think about shared vision and that it's more than just like a nice little thing that you put on a wall, but how does it really shape the ongoing organizational learning and the way that we build that learning and other sorts of mindsets and ways and stuff like that? So, anyway, that's what I wanted to sort of wind up with, and then hope that my colleagues do a better job of running with the other four things that bring us further. I don't know who's next, Teresa.
I will take it next. And that was a fantastic windup because you're right. You're talking about shared vision, and all of the other elements that Justin, Tony, Morgan, and I are going to discuss are ways that we try to bring that to life. I focus, Blake, on what you were saying. You use the word anchor, like our shared vision is our anchor, and context. And that term especially segues into what I would like to talk about. The shared vision is the context in which we work. I'm going to talk about mental models. And the point that I hope to make is that they are very contingent on context and that we can use that to our advantage. So um, the TLC theme paraphrases Senge's definition of mental models as deeply ingrained assumptions and generalizations. And these impact the way that we see the world, the way we see ourselves, the way we take action when we work. And he suggests that if we refine these mental models, we can help a culture and an organization embrace a culture of learning. I'd like to think a little bit about how to refine a model by unpacking the term model itself for a few minutes. Senge's model is a very abstract thing, but a model could also be something really concrete that we put together using stuff that we hold in our hands. Often models are explicitly meant to replicate something else that we can see in the world. They come with pieces and parts and really specific instructions for how those are supposed to fit together. I'm thinking of all the X-Wing fighters I had to watch my brothers put together when we were kids. Yes, yeah. Um, Alternatively, models could be creative. We use them to convey something that's in our heads or to try out a way to solve a problem. In this regard, think of like the Wright brothers and the models of their first planes. So let's consider these kinds of models, like the kinds that you can hold, in terms of their components, which are materials, like the pieces and parts of the model, and then form, the way that we put them together. And I know this will come as no surprise to my immediate colleagues, but I'm going to do this with you by talking about humanities stuff for a little bit. But I hope that it is helpful. So I find analogies from literary theory to be very helpful to me. In the early 20th century, there was a group of literary critics who called themselves the formalists, and they were really concerned with the relationship between materials and form and meaning in artistic work, specifically because these guys were like iconoclasts. They wanted to just break down these like lofty visions that people had of art and literature by saying, we can demystify this. The deeply ingrained assumption about art was that it was the stuff of genius, that we couldn't understand it and only a rarefied group of people could make it. But the formalists were saying, no, that's not really the case. If you break it down into material and form, we can figure this out. There's a famous formalist, Yuri Tinyanov, who argued in the 1920s that literary forms, like a poetic ode, for example, were not static manifestations of genius. Instead, they were dynamic things whose function rested in the socio-historical and cultural context in which the materials that people used to put them together, defined them. So For example, Tynyanov explained that, an artist writing an ode in the 18th century would have intended to honor the subject, and people would have understood it to be that way. But an artist doing that in the 1920s most certainly would have meant it as a satire, and everyone would have understood, like, oh, this is a joke, even though the form was the same, right? By the way, if I remember correctly, UAGC's own Dr. Dan Tynyanov is the great nephew of this Yuri Tynyanov. He can correct me if I'm wrong, but ask him next time you talk to him. I learned this about him a while ago and thought it was like super cool. Um, so this question of material and form also shows up in the visual arts. There's another famous Russian painter and sculptor, Vladimir Tatlin, who's really famous for this gigantic model he made of a monument to the Third Soviet International. You should Google it sometime. It's this really wonderful, strange thing. Tatlin abided by this philosophy that an artist should strive to discover the potential inherent to the makeup of the materials that they were using, that they should use the materials' natural strengths and differences to create their work. And a great example of what he meant by this is in his counter reliefs. So, whereas a relief is how a sculptor cuts into material to make the sculpture, Tatlin did a counter relief where he surfaced the material to make the sculpture. There's a cool example of this in 1915. He did a counter relief that he made of found material from factories and shipyards, kind of rough stuff that he plopped in this fancy art gallery. But instead of hanging it on a wall, he figured out how to use those materials' inherent strengths and tensions so that they kind of like hung themselves on the wall in a corner. Um, so I think this digression into literary and art theory could be helpful as we think about how we refine mental models, because it reminds us that if we break down our deeply ingrained assumptions, they're really just materials and forms, and we can manipulate them in all kinds of ways. We might uncover new functions and meanings, as Tynyanov's writing suggested, or we might create entirely new things, like Tatlin's counterrelief. And when I reflect on UAGC as a learning organization, I can see lots of activity that is involving this kind of reflection on the material of our work, the forms that we put it in, and it's allowing us to evolve with our new context and create new things. A great example is how UAGC faculty and academic staff right now are reflecting on the structure of our degree programs. In previous historical contexts in higher ed, a discipline-specific 120 credit bachelor's degree program was the standard. What is the function of that material and that form in our context today? Our institution's responding to that by teasing apart all these component parts of our academic programs, like the learning outcomes, for example, examining their natural strengths and their differences to identify how they might work together differently and create new learning pathways for our students. Likewise, we're uncovering new interdisciplinary connections that might help us respond to our new business and military and community partner contexts and needs. And I could think of 800,000 more examples of this, and I hope we get to talk about more. I know you'll hear more from the rest of the leaders here. But the key is that every example is examining the pieces and parts of what we do at our institution, the forms in which we use them, and asking what meaning and effect those generate in our context. And we creatively move them around and repurpose them to remodel what we do. And this remodeling is an exercise in the continuous clarification of who we are as an institution. So I think that's a great segue into what Justin is going to talk about regarding personal mastery.
Thanks, Teresa. And yeah, as Teresa said, I'll be talking about personal mastery. And it fits a lot with what Teresa and Blake were talking about, because as I was thinking through personal mastery defined in this context, it has a lot to do with vision and purpose. So people with high levels of personal mastery, they understand their why, their reason to be, and they act in accord with that vision. And they basically do that in all aspects of their lives, including in their work. So they're able to align their vision and values and goals with their work. and they do this effectively. So I was thinking about that a lot, and what's my vision, right? What is the vision for my life, and how am I bringing about my best existence? And I thought the only way to really have a vision for your life is to know who you are. And so I just kept thinking of like the dictum, know thyself. And that was inscribed in the Temple of Apollo in ancient Greece, and it's also in various cultures. Um, this idea that the highest form of human knowledge is actually going inside yourself and figuring out who you are, which is a lot harder than it seems, right? Humans don't inscribe things in temples that are easy, right? So, so it's really difficult to know ourselves, but if we don't know who we are, then the vision that we create for our life, the thing that we're trying to personally master, is not going to be in alignment with who we are. So our goals won't be really about ourselves. Instead, they'll be living out somebody else's expectations for our life. And if you've ever lived out somebody else's expectation for your life, I did for probably about a decade. It's a really miserable place to be. Um, so the as academics, we spend a lot of time like listening to people talk, like right now, and reading articles and reading books and listening to what other people tell us about the world. And we actually listen a lot, even though sometimes it might seem like we don't. Um, but how many of us actually go down into the depths of ourselves, right? How many of us actually sit in the evening and think about like, who am I? What am I becoming? What do I want to become? A lot of times, especially in our society, it's really difficult, especially with social media and everything trying to get our attention external to ourselves, to go inside of ourselves. If it was hard for the Greeks 2,500 years ago, it's even harder now to really think about who we are. But people who know themselves don't just know like the good aspects of themselves. If you really know yourself, you've also confronted the dark and painful and sometimes shameful aspects of yourself. So you recognize your strengths, but in recognizing your strengths, you also recognize your weaknesses, your insecurities, and you're open and honest about those things. And it helps you accept the weaknesses and insecurities and failures of other people, because you recognize all of those things probably even more in yourself than in others. So knowing yourself is the totality. But then I was thinking, it's not just enough to know yourself to create a vision for your life that you can act on, that's in conformity with like what you're supposed to be. You have to take a second step, which is equally as easy, and that's to radically accept yourself. So I think we all know examples of people who they know that they're an artist, or they feel that impetus inside of themselves, but they quench it. They don't write poetry. They don't paint paintings. Instead, they sell insurance or something. Now, it's not bad to sell insurance. Wallace Stevens is a great example. He was a vice president in a huge insurance company, but he was also one of the best poets of all time. And they said that he wrote his poems while he like walked to work in the morning, and then he would write at night. So he was a poet. That's who he really was. And then he sold insurance. And he did well at that too. But anyway, like I think we've all like experienced that, where the opposite of that, where somebody just sells insurance and they don't explore the other strange and weird aspects of themselves. So, but then how do we radically accept ourselves, right? This is an even more difficult question than the knowing thyself question. But if I like to think about like human relationships. So the best way to create a strong friendship or relationship is to approach another human with openness, care, curiosity, and acceptance, right? That's all we want from the time that we're babies. We want people to be interested in us, to care for us, and to accept us no matter what. So instead of rejecting or exiling these dark parts of ourselves, or the pain or the shame or the guilt or the anxiety that we feel, we need to work to try to radically accept those parts. So the two things that I think about on personal mastery and creating a vision and acting in alignment with it are to know yourself and to radically accept yourself. So the good news is, in the last 30 seconds I have here, I've created a framework. I'll walk everybody through it. You'll know yourself at the end and you'll be able to accept yourself. So here we go. No, right? That's not the way it works. This is a lifelong journey. And for those who undertake it, many don't, but for those who do undertake it, it will go on until the day that you leave the earth, right? You will continually think about who you are, and that will change over time. The things you care about will change over time. Um, and you might never be able to fully radically accept all parts of yourself. But if you continue this journey, it will change your life, and it'll change the way that you show up in all aspects of your life. And I believe that your life gets better when you engage in this. So personal mastery, it's not about becoming perfect or mastering yourself or disciplining yourself into submission. It's more about aligning with who you are, accepting who you are, and working to become a whole person. So with that, I will turn it over to Tony for the next pillar.
Thanks, Justin. Wow, that's a lot to think about. And actually, listening to you talk, I kind of started adjusting my notes a little bit. And, I know we're reflecting on sharing some personal stories. And, when you talk about knowing yourself, and how does this align with my pillar, which is Senge's fourth discipline, team learning. So, I went away to college, yeah, and I think a lot of you know my story. Maybe some of you don't, but I went away to college. I'm, you know, single mom, lived in a one bedroom apartment for 12 years, growing up. And I was a first generation college student, but I was a baseball player. And, I went away to school, um, to play baseball. And when I got to school, some of the things that you were saying, Justin, about knowing thyself, I kind of walked away from that a little bit. I was a business major because I grew up in poverty, and when I went away to school, all I wanted to do is I wanted to make as much money as I possibly could so that I didn't have to really kind of live in kind of the circumstances that I grew up in. And so I will tell you, I was a miserable business major. Miserable. That my first business stats class, I said, this is absolutely not what I want to do. And that does not discount all the great business majors that we have and our business programs. This was not my path. And so I came back. I came back home. I had to leave school because of some financial situations. And my high school, um, my high school needed a junior varsity head baseball coach. Um, and I wasn't going to play. I left school in the middle of the year, so I wasn't going to play. And so my head coach, who was my mentor, who really was one of the reasons why I'm here today, um, basically said, do you want to coach this team? And I was 18 years old, and I was a head JV baseball coach of kids that I had played with the year before. And so um, I fell in love with coaching. I fell in love with teaching. I fell in love with education. And this is where this concept of team learning and being a part of a team really resonates with me. And when we were talking about what different pillars do we want to talk about, for me, this was the one because I really believe that, yeah, the impact of being a coach, a teammate, a team leader over the years has really shaped me and who I am and how I see the world and how I lead. And so it was really important to me, in thinking about what does team learning look like and how does that apply to the work that I'm doing today. And so, what Senge says about team learning is that teams become more than the sum of their parts when they think together. They develop alignment, insight, and then coordinated action. And, when we think about the vision, that is exactly what we're talking about. And, Justin, I think about what you said about personal mastery, and then Teresa, what you said about those mental models and kind of where we're going right now related to transforming what education could look like, not only at UAGC, but within the whole ecosystem of higher ed. I mean, we could be absolute game changers. And I think part of that, again, comes from this leadership team and we are all greater than the sum of our parts. And that is to me, that is how I absolutely see the work that I do when I'm leading my teams. Because I will tell you, quite honestly, there's been a lot of change over the last several months. I mean, we went from two colleges, Division of Gen Ed, to two colleges, And in my world right now, I have 5 divisions, 10 departments, 56 academic programs, and 87 full-time faculty. And so if we looked at each of those elements as a silo and said, we can't learn from each other, that would be such a waste. It would be a tremendous waste of not just talent, but the synergy and leaning in onto some of the Covey work that I've done. Synergy, the sum of us together creates 1 and 1 equals 3, right? And so that to me is so powerful is that we have this tremendous opportunity for, you know, to collaborate, interdepartmental initiatives, thinking across aisles when it comes to the work that we're doing. I mean, I learn so much every day, not, from our faculty. Our faculty are brilliant. Our leaders are brilliant. This team that you're seeing here, these leaders are so collaborative and they're all extremely brilliant and competent that the synergy that comes together from the learning that we're doing is going to create a pathway for, I believe, for our institution moving forward that is absolutely going to be I don't I'm trying to be as tactful as I can at this point, but it is going to be amazing. And I think it's going to be a difference maker in the world of higher education. I truly believe that. And so I don't want to ramble on because I know Morgan is going to pull us all together, but this idea of team learning and being better than the sum of our parts is really so important. And I think that I'm just honored to be a part of this team and to really help be a part of what is going to be an exciting future for UAGC. And so, with that being said, Morgan, I'm gonna pass it off to you.
Thanks, Tony. That's a hard act to follow. And selfishly, I asked to be in the caboose of this because I thought it was critical for you all to hear about each of these disciplines before we talk about systems thinking. In part because as the fifth discipline, really it's hard to talk about wrapping it all together, as Tony noted, without hearing about personal mastery, mental models, shared vision, and team learning first. For those that were able to attend the opening session of TLC, I think Haley did an incredible job talking about each of these areas, polling all participants and finding out like which of these do folks want to hear more about. And systems thinking came to the top naturally, but more in an applied way, right? Like, how do we think about systems thinking as it applies to our day-to-day work, as an institution, as an individual, and as a team? And so I'm hopeful we'll get some crowd participation during this section. At its core, systems thinking really is this concept of seeing the big picture. So if you were able to attend Stephanie Kilby and Joe Kappa's session on Tuesday, they talked about project management and agile processes to address some of our student success work. I think the brilliance in how they've kind of brought systems thinking into that conversation, though, was about this idea that you get from point A to point B in a very linear way, which I think we all know in practice in our day-to-day work, like that is not how things work, right? It's messy. There's not just a point A and a point B. There's a point A through Z, and there's a million zigzaggy ways that we get to each of those, and there's overlap. And it's really a circular process, right? We're not talking about a straight process from one point to the next to get from a problem to a solution. And that, I think, the visual that they shared really encapsulates like what systems thinking is. It's not just about solving problems, but it's understanding the underlying structures that produce the problems in the first place. What's beneath the service specifically. So I think in terms of practical application, thinking about in higher ed for those, at UAGC or other institutions, how do we approach conversations about student success, right? It's not just about the outcome of retention, completion, or some of those leading indicators like persistence from term to term. We're talking about larger systems in terms of policy, what are barriers to students coming in to the classroom? What are financial considerations? What are some of the systems they live within? And then what are the teams and individuals behind each of those pieces to the puzzle, and how do they operate? When we think about faculty in particular, maybe faculty workload and considerations around teaching and research considerations, there's a lot of pieces impacting that, right? What does student enrollment look like? What are research requirements for particular roles? What are institutional reward systems? So these are all very complex systems that are impacting problems that we're all trying to solve on a daily basis. Um, it's easy, I think, sometimes, and we are all, me included on a regular basis, fall victim to this idea that we can fix things quickly. But really, what we're doing is short-term band-aids on things that really need to go below, again, the surface to understand, like, where is the problem actually starting from, and how do we work together collectively to address that? The systems thinking piece that I love, though, and hearing it throughout the conference this week, some of the examples, is mapping systems before we actually take action. I think we saw that in several presentations. There were several great presentations specifically on like retention, for example. How are we addressing in any of our institutions ways to improve retention? Doesn't start with here's the problem and here's how we're going to get to a solution. It starts with understanding what are the policies, what are the individuals that are part of these systems, and then how do we start to test and learn different interventions, which is part of the systems thinking framework, right? Let's not go forward with a full solution. Let's actually, and it's probably the catchphrase you've all heard multiple times this week, how might we? Like, how might we approach a change to something, reflect on it, learn from it, and then potentially scale larger approaches to those changes. So I'm hopeful some of you will start to share in the chat a little bit about how you might see systems thinking in your day-to-day. But ultimately, I think as part of this conversation contextually, I think it's just important to walk away with thinking about us as like a living, breathing system, right? The relationships, purpose, and learning we're all talking about make up who we are. And I love Tony's use of the word synergy. We have to be able to identify these. So collectively, as a group, we can identify lasting transformation within our institutions. So Teresa, I'll hand it back over to you and Haley.
Wonderful. Thank you, Morgan and everybody. This was really fun. I think a little bit of each of us personally came out in these talks, and it's just fun to see that. We don't get to all the time. So really appreciate it. Everybody, please feel free to engage with us in the chat, asking questions, making points. Haley and I can help surface those for the group. To start, though, I don't know if this is so much a question as an observation, but maybe a jumping off point for us to reflect a little bit more. Justin's profound point about the challenge and the joy in coming to know yourself really connects for me to what the crux of a learning plan is. It also ties into, Tony, your the experience you shared as a business student who, you know, came into your love of education by coaching baseball. Just like a learning plan is a series of experiments that we perform to some end. Maybe that end we don't exactly know what it is in the beginning, and that's okay. That's what we do when we come to know ourselves as well. And this is meaningful for me. I had the joy of being on a panel with Tom Bourgeois earlier in the day, who also gave some baseball examples, Tony, but was talking about a different kind of scaffolding. Like Morgan was saying, we can't always get from point A to point B. We can't always get from step to step directly, but sometimes a scaffold might be over here or over here. Maybe we have to get off kilter a little bit sometimes in order to grow. But this is tying this all together with me. So coming back to original point here, what connections do you see between that know thyself charge and what a learning plan is?
Are you asking any of us or the group? Because I love
Whoever
that
wants to talk
question.
first.
Well, I'll talk because I'm so glad I went first because I'd be embarrassed to go after you guys. Um, I think it's interesting, listening to Justin's very compelling and interesting thinking about thyself, and then thinking about how that fits in a team. Um, and I think I see as a leader different types of fitting in a team, which is the bull in the china shop fit, where like this is what I do. I hope you like it. There's the I'm just gonna conform and I'm not really gonna be myself, kind of type. And then if you bring it around to sort of the either modeling that Teresa talked about, where someone sees a model of how teaming works, or the systems thinking where they see what their role is in a larger system that Morgan talked about, you can start to see how whoever you are fits into that. And I think that's a great challenge in a learning organization is a leader seeing the contributory brilliance of the team members coming together to make that whole grid in the parts, like Tony said, um, and enabling that rather than directing that. And so, how do you light that up and let people find that space for whatever spiritual gifts they bring to the table, and fit that in with the system and the team so that it works? And that's a really tough challenge.
We are getting some comments in the chat while others are thinking. Alexa shared about truthfully acknowledging the dark parts of ourselves, noting that we're self as individual, team, company, or other group. And for me, that connects to Gary's thoughts, Dr. Packard's thoughts that he shared with us at the beginning about the different ecosystems that we function in. And Alexa is observing that there's no way to accurately address the dark parts of ourselves, but in truth and courage, we can go forward together. Oh, and she appreciates the focus on synergy. Thank you so much for sharing, Alexa.
I just want to make one note about Alexa's comment, because it's kind of what I was thinking about related to my takeaway here is, and I appreciate this about Justin's leadership style always, but vulnerability, right? Because I think this model requires self vulnerability as well as team and organizational vulnerability to be able to actually take a step back, reflect in an honest, open way, and that is hard. So I think the Alexa, her use of the words courage to be able to get there and be maybe productive is not the right word, but impactful in this model, vulnerability is really a requirement to do so.
I think Blake, I'll kind of respond to that piece about how do we get people to share themselves and I think a lot of that has to do with building an environment of trust. I mean, you have to have a high trust environment and being very purposeful. And I think, when I think about the great leaders that I've worked for, and even those leaders that have shown me lessons on how not to lead. I think the biggest thing for me is I look at the integrity of the leader. Um, if for me, someone that has high integrity, and then what is their intent? And so, in thinking about even decisions or things that may not make us happy as an individual contributor or in a situation that may not align with how we think. But if you can get behind the fact that it's a high trust environment and that leader has integrity and the intent is always, and I would frame it, let's say, in like our culture of care pillars, as student center. For me, that's the foundational piece of the work that I feel like we're doing, is that the things that we're doing is for the good of our students and for their benefit, and obviously we're wanting to take care of, in my world, faculty and associate faculty. But I think if you frame that in a high trust environment with tremendous integrity and intent, then I think that you can bring those individuals forward who may not be the bull in the china shop, but may be the quieter contributor, and give them, a voice. I think it's really hard for them to have voices or have a voice when there is not a high trust environment.
Tony, if any of you listened to me chat yesterday about strategic planning versus learning planning, the critical pivot is on trust like that. That a traditional, an absurd way of looking at a strategic plan is that's a low trust document meant to direct people on what to do and not trust them to figure it out. And we've developed a culture of little faith that finding yourself and your strength, building models of that, figuring out how that fits in a system and teaming together toward a shared vision, is something that we can collectively do rather than have that planned out for us ahead of time. So I love your focus on trust in that, because a learning organization has to actually trust not just the learning, but the people in it in order for it to work. Yeah.
I
Awesome.
noticed that Dr. Rosa in the chat suggested that we, don't miss out on this conversation, the opportunity to take next steps. And I realize this might not be exactly what he's getting at, but I think we all probably have several examples from our immediate worlds or what we're seeing happening at the institution of how we're employing these different concepts. In meaningful ways. So I wondered if everybody wanted to share some of those to maybe give an idea for what next steps could be.
I'll start because something occurs to me that often when you're in a high change environment, which our institution happens to be at this point in time, for those of you that aren't part of UAGC might have heard that we're in a big change period, and it's the default for that is not to be learning but directing, because we have to get from point A to point B, and here are the bounds, and just get it done. And so I think my personal commitment, recently, really thinking about these past 3 days, is how do we get out of that? Even while change has to progress and sometimes at a dictated pace, how do we still do that with a learning stance about the way to get there and take the time for that along the way? It's tough.
Yeah, I can jump in next, hopefully with a maybe example that will resonate with UAGC folks, but beyond, because I'm sure it's called something different at other institutions, but we're in on the tail end of a 90-day sprint right now, right, where we took very strategic problems, put teams around those problems across the institution to try to test and learn solutions, learn from the outcomes, and then potentially scale those in other different ways. And I think, number one, I think from a learning organization perspective, like the approach here, to Blake's point, like no one said like, we want to get from point A to point B. It was more, we have this is the current context environment. We want to get over here to this context and environment, but it's going to take a lot of folks to define what that looks like, how we get there, and we need to learn what works and what doesn't along the way so that can inform next steps related to this work. And the work is around student success, our academic program, student experience, right? Like it's a myriad of areas institutionally we're looking at. But one of the initiatives that I think has been incredible to watch is the RISE initiatives that I know Justin's really involved with, just to see dispersed groups of individuals and leaders and team members, staff members, everyone in between coming together around an individual student's needs and better understanding like what the student needs to be successful in a current course or current situation that they might be in, and non-traditional, I think, avenues and ways that team has taken to get to said solution versus like here's the systems we have in place or here's the policy we have in place. And I think it's just been a great example of like collaboration and a model that we might be able to apply to other problems that we try to solve collectively as institution moving forward. Justin, no pressure if you want to say anything about Rise, but
No, I guess I was thinking about through the lens of like personal mastery, because, in the work context, people who have high levels of personal mastery are highly effective and they create really positive outcomes. And the only way that I think we can do that effectively and sustainably is, like you said, Morgan, working with different departments. So the more that we can work with, respect, collaborate with, instead of seeing other departments sometimes as maybe contradictory or unnecessary, or having kind of an antagonistic relationship, just reframing it through the collaboration that we all know is necessary. And I can tell you that there's nobody who knows the difficulties of students better than advisors, right? The student academic advisors. And so if you don't consider like an advisor as a resource for knowledge, if you think that there's somebody that you push student issues to or whatever, then you're limiting your capacity for effectiveness. And so there's just tons of opportunity to learn from every single department. And everybody has a different perspective. And yeah, the great part about Rise, especially the Teams chat, is whenever there's a student issue, you get to see the perspective of student affairs, advising, registrar operations, financial aid. And everybody has a truthful perspective, but they're all different, right? Because they see the different aspects of the student. So you get a really nice holistic vision. But then when you work with people and you're kind and you're collaborative, you develop relationships and friendships. And of course, if you get along with the people that you work with, the students are going to feel that and you're going to have more success, just flat out. If you don't get along with other people, you don't collaborate, or you don't see them as having inherent value and importance, then the outcome of your work is just going to be fragmented and disparate and, not effective.
I think in both the examples you give, Morgan and Justin, too, what stands out to me to connect back to the idea of models, all the changes that are happening at our institution and the ways we're working through them across departments are not saying that the materials, that all the elements that we have are wrong or bad or something in any way. Rather, we're kind of like dumping everything out on the table and saying, like, where should this go now? And, maybe somebody over here has a popsicle stick and that will help us build this thing over here. And, maybe somebody else has a cotton ball that we can use to, like, I don't know, right? Make our little stick sculpture. But the point is that this all, from where I sit, is optimization rather than fixing something or um, just reacting to something. It is taking all the best parts of who we are and what we do and configuring them in a way that helps us to solve problems and grow and things like that. So. We have a few minutes. Tony, is there anything you'd like to add as well?
Well, I guess in responding to Dr. Rosa's question about how are we taking our individual pillars and moving them forward, I'm really excited about an opportunity that I'm going to have with my college to facilitate a leadership institute, where we are going to really dig deep in what collaboration and team building looks like, and part of that will be the ability to really move, I think, our faculty and leaders forward in developing these skills related to intent and collaboration and communication. So I'm really excited about that. And my perspective related to how this all aligns is that, the investment that we have in our own personal development, I think going back to that personal mastery, and seeing ourselves, as again, we are a learning institution. We should invest in our own personal development and getting better and learning. And I know we have a lot of stuff going on, but I would just say I would encourage all of us, and myself included, to really put aside time to read, to get better, to look at something in a manner of personal development, because your own personal development will positively impact the team. And thinking about our vision and our why, I think there's that synergy piece of it will, at the end of the day, positively impact our students. So
Well, thank you, Tony. Thank you, everybody, for this conversation and everyone for joining. Haley, if you want to wrap us up and send us off to the last session.
Happy to do so. I just want to note that we had quite a captive audience, so kudos to you as a leadership team for being authentic, genuine, being vulnerable with the folks here that are part of the hard work that we are all doing to support our students in achieving their goals. Next up, I would love it if everyone would share their feedback on this session via the link in the chat. And in just a couple of moments, we will segue to the closing session and send out the 11th annual TLC Teaching and Learning Conference with a bang. So I hope to see all of you there at the closing session. And thank you again to this team. Appreciate it.